Before we begin, let's set the mood. Take a deep breath, the kind where your shoulders sigh with relief. Let your thoughts slip softly out of the room and leave the door ajar. Now, picture a building, grand, grey and foreboding, as if someone designed a castle for people who'd been caught laughing at tea time. This, dear listener, is an American insane asylum in the 19th century, a place where the porridge was tepid, the diagnoses creative, and escape ill-advised. At first glance, one might think the asylum was a place of quiet repose, green lawns, tall windows, and names like Hummock Hill Retreat or Restful Pines Sanitaria. But behind the high stone walls and poetic euphemism was a curious slice of history, where medicine, morality, and a vague suspicion of women who read novels all came together into one clanking, chalk-scented building. Let's enter very gently through the side door, where the laundry carts go, and the rules are slightly more abstract. Inside, the air smells faintly of boiled linens and carbolic acid. Bells ring at intervals determined not by time, but by Nurse Margie's sense of dramatic flair. The year is 1884, and mental health treatment is still in its experimental hat-wearing phase. Now, to even reach the point of being institutionalized in the 1800s, one didn't need to be violently unwell or even moderately concerned. Diagnoses like melancholia, hysteria, and my personal favorite, moral insanity, were thrown around with the flair of a bad poet at open mic night. One could be committed for speaking too fast, walking too slow, or looking blankly at a goose, or being a woman with opinions. Rachel from New Haven, for example, found herself admitted after loudly refusing to marry a dentist. She was labelled unruly and inclined to question the Lord's wisdom. 3 months in the quiet ward fixed that, or at the very least, made her extremely quiet. As for the doctors, well, they strutted about like magicians halfway through their own disappearing act. Most were earnest men with magnificent facial hair and a blessed ignorance of neuroscience. Treatments ran the gamut from the warm and well-meaning, like rest cures, fresh air, and gentle moral guidance, to the more inventive, such as spinning chairs, surprise baths, or electroshock delivered with something resembling a tuning fork and poor judgment. Now, I know what modern you is thinking. That sounds stressful. But like any institution of its time, the asylum was a place of routines. Routines so steady, so achingly repetitive, that many patients simply gave in to the rhythm and floated along. Wake up at dawn to the sound of a wooden cowbell. Wash your face in water that remembers being warm. Recite scripture or stare blankly at the wallpaper. Then line up for breakfast. And here, we must talk about the porridge. They served it every day, sometimes twice, always lukewarm, always grey, and always with that vague scent of commitment. Was it oats? Was it rye? Sometimes it whispered of turnip. If the cook was feeling experimental, you might find a single, suspicious raisin. And oh, the politics of raisins. They were a kind of edible currency, traded under the tables like stock options. The ward staff, a mixture of sour-tempered matrons and wide-eyed junior attendants, ran the place like a theatre company deep in debt. Everything was performance. The quiet movements, the hushed tones, the way they'd murmur, "mind your feelings," while strapping you to a bed labelled for calming purposes only. Of course, there were success stories, or at least reclassifications. Patients who'd shuffle in with wide eyes and wander out with narrower ones, having learned the useful trick of serenity. Charles, who once declared he heard God in the wallpaper, left the asylum a quieter man, convinced instead that angels preferred the baseboards. Progress, of a sort. Now and then, Anne, inspector from the state, would turn up, clipboard in hand, eyes skimming past the peeling wallpaper and toward the lunchroom pudding. Everyone would behave. Nurses smiled more, doctors tucked their beards in, and the patients were encouraged to walk normally, even if some hadn't walked in weeks. The question, of course, is, would you last longer than a day in here? Could you manage the porridge politics, the philosophical bed straps, the 6 a.m. turnip whisper? Or would you begin to gently unravel after morning hymn number 7? Regardless, dear dreamer, rest easy. The halls may be creaky and the diagnoses questionable, but you're safe here, wrapped in the warm fog of history, one spoon of grey porridge at a time. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes and listen for the gentle clink of the nurse's boots. Still pacing softly down the hall. In the year 1871, tucked somewhere between the invention of barbed wire and the first game of rugby, a peculiar trend swept across America and Europe like a draft through a broken asylum window. An alarming enthusiasm for identifying, organizing, and institutionalizing the mentally unwell. Or more accurately, anyone who failed to conform to society's increasingly narrow definition of well enough. You see, the 19th century had many things. Horse-drawn carriages, corsets that could compress your ribs into resignation, and a curious belief that most problems could be solved with a stern physician, a metal cage bed, and perhaps a teaspoon of mercury. And the asylums, oh the asylums, became the final resting place of logic itself. Let's drift back in time, quietly now, to the threshold of the Bloomingdale Asylum in New York City, an institution that opened its grand, ponderous doors in 1821. Its high stone walls and columned entryways conveyed a kind of contradictory hospitality, like a manor home for the mind, but only if the mind was sufficiently confused. The surrounding landscape was pastoral, the gardens lovingly tended, ostensibly to soothe the nerves. Though one might argue that being locked inside a Gothic fortress surrounded by floral arrangements is little reassurance when the men in white coats consider your fondness for reading novels a clinical concern. Indeed, one of the most peculiar aspects of 19th century asylums was their open-ended definition of insanity. You could end up committed for just about anything that didn't delight your husband, terrify your neighbor, or align with the prevailing Victorian sensibilities. Women, in particular, were alarmingly vulnerable. Feeling irritable, hysteria, reading too many books, hysteria, expressing an opinion louder than a whisper. Unforgivable female hysteria, undoubtedly caused by a wandering womb, which was, I regret to tell you, an actual medical theory. As for men, their route to institutionalization was often paved by more florid infractions, spending too much money, disagreeing with your employer, or, charmingly, being Irish in the wrong town on the wrong day. The diagnoses were as colourful as they were subjective. Melancholia, moral insanity, acute mania, and the ever-elusive habit of masturbation, a condition considered as dangerous as smallpox and treated with exactly the same amount of panic. Now, if you had the misfortune of being admitted, congratulations were not in order. Your first experience might involve a personal inventory, where a nurse would carefully document your possessions before taking them away forever. Say goodbye to your hat, your watch, and possibly your dignity. In return, you'd be provided with a coarse wool uniform and a chamber pot. a package deal designed more for containment than comfort. Private asylums, like the aforementioned Bloomingdale, considered themselves paragons of progressive moral care. That meant patients were encouraged to labor in the gardens, attend loosely structured dances, and occasionally sit in rooms full of furniture never meant to be sat on. Public institutions, on the other hand, well, that's where things began to slide sideways. In the underfunded, overcrowded facilities, patients were more likely to encounter restraints than restorative care. Straitjackets, rotating chairs, meant to spin the madness out of a person, and of course, cold water immersion baths, a wellness practice akin to being shoved unwillingly into a well with scientific ambition. British asylums, not to be outdone, offered their own grim flair. The infamous Bedlam Hospital, by then officially known as the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, had entered the century trying, with noble yet fumbling intent, to modernize. But their idea of progress still occasionally included leech therapy and bloodletting, administered by physicians who were only slightly more lucid than their patients. Interestingly, some doctors began to argue for more humane treatments. Psychiatry was just poking its head out of the cradle, rubbing its eyes and trying to tie a cravat. Figures like Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride in the US promoted moral treatment, which emphasized kindness, cleanliness, and structure. His theories led to a nationwide boom in stately asylum architecture, the so-called Kirkbride Plan. These were grand buildings, symmetrical and sprawling, designed to heal the mind through majestic corridors and plenty of windows. A nice idea, really. A bit like trying to solve heartbreak by redecorating the attic. Still, in the quieter moments, between the unpredictability of treatments and diagnoses, there were flashes of good intention. Patients wrote letters, sang songs, organized readings. A woman once wrote in her diary at an Illinois asylum, "I am not alone, that helps." And that's the strange paradox of these places. They could be prisons built on prejudice, or sanctuaries crafted by hope. Often both. So as you wander now through these long, austere hallways of history, consider the peal of laughter echoing through a ward. Not madness, not always. Sometimes just someone remembering a funny story from before they arrived, or telling one. And as we dim the gas lights and let the wind hush softly against the window panes, let us quietly inch a little further inside. There's someone you simply must meet. It was the smell that greeted you first. Not a pungent, slap-you-in-the-nose kind of stench, though, rest assured, that would come later, but more of a lingering cocktail. Mildew patina, something medicinal with a vengeful spirit, and a whisper of cabbage that had clearly overstayed its welcome. This was the olfactory welcome mat of your average 19th century American insane asylum. And yes, rather than calling it a psychiatric hospital, they called it an asylum, a word that used to mean a place offering safety and shelter before it was spirited away, tied up, and locked in the metaphorical attic of language. The windows were tall but narrowed with iron bars, dull enough in design to suggest architects had collectively decided that hope was an unnecessary architectural feature. The buildings themselves, often inspired by a charming little blueprint known as the Kirkbride Plan, resembled grand Victorian palaces from a distance, only to feel more like Gothic boarding schools for the tragically misunderstood upon closer inspection. Ah yes, the Kirkbride Plan, a bold mid-century attempt to arrange human suffering into aesthetically pleasing symmetry. The idea was to build asylums in sprawling wings, each carefully staggered to allow for optimum natural light and cross breezes. It was noble, even revolutionary in its theory. environment affects mental well-being. A tranquil campus might soothe troubled minds. Unfortunately, nobody informed the cockroaches, and the funding often ran out before the building was finished. Nevertheless, the blueprints looked quite fancy in newsletters. Once past the iron gates, you'd encounter a bureaucratic labyrinth of check-ins and evaluations. You might think this meant interviews with trained professionals, but no. This was the 1800s, darling. Your diagnostic fate might be decided by your husband, who found your opinions tiresome, or by your aunt, who disliked your left-handedness. Sometimes even local clergy got a say. The admissions logs of certain asylums remain silent little museums of injustice, indigestion, novel reading, imaginary female trouble. One especially tragic diagnosis: kicked in the head by a horse, which, yes, is a valid medical event, but hardly clarifies whether the patient needed therapy or just a bag of ice. Once inside, you were stripped of your clothes and your name, given a number, a gown, and perhaps the uncomfortably enthusiastic greeting of Nurse Mildred, who rarely blinked and may or may not have been invented by Dickens. Everyday life followed a meticulously regimented schedule. And I do mean meticulous. Wake-up bell at 5:45 a.m., followed by cold sponge baths administered in an assembly line fashion, as though everyone involved were just slightly too enthusiastic about human discomfort. Breakfast was porridge, often styled in the culinary traditions of grey and lumpy. Then came patient duties, a charming euphemism for unpaid labour. If you were lucky, you'd be assigned to milking dairy cows or making thread in the asylum's textile wing. If you weren't, you might spend your morning scrubbing a floor that had long since abandoned hope. The guiding theory behind this structure was moral treatment. It was a surprisingly progressive idea. Kindness, structure, and fresh air might help improve mental health. But kindness was often interpreted rather creatively, like when restraint meant leather straps and being confined to the Utica crib, a padded wooden box locked from the outside, a cozy nap prison, if you will. There were therapeutic outings too. Patients might be led, under heavy supervision, into the gardens for a walk among the stunted shrubbery, or allowed to participate in something called lunatic theatricals. Yes, that's the real term. It meant amateur plays put on by patients, which sounds charming until you realize the scripts were often written by the staff, unless you think being medicated meant little amber bottles on a tidy nightstand. I regret to inform you that the 19th century pharmacopoeia was more thriller than remedy. Treatments included mercury pills, bad, opium, bad but popular, and something sweetly labelled soothing syrups, which mostly consisted of alcohol and whatever herbs hadn't been outlawed yet. If none of those worked, and they usually didn't, the next step might be hydrotherapy, which sounds spa-like until you realize it involved being wrapped like a sad burrito in cold, wet sheets and left immobile for hours, sometimes days. There was also the occasional experiment with rotating chairs, which were spun wildly to rebalance the mind. Spoiler, they mostly provoked nausea. Still, even in their bleakness, these institutions often had touches of high aspiration. Music rooms harbored out-of-tune pianos. Libraries stocked dog-eared volumes of Byron and moral instruction. Some doctors genuinely believed they were pioneering a new era of humane care. But the gap between belief and practice often yawned wide and dark. As you tiptoe deeper into the halls of our story, keep your ears sharp for the next ghostly detail, because the real intrigue isn't in the treatments, but in the people who shuffled through those corridors. It was breakfast time at the asylum. though breakfast, in this case, might be too flattering a word. In my reality, it was more of a warm suggestion of food, a fleeting whisper of nutrition loosely affiliated with the idea of a meal. Picture a pale, lukewarm porridge plopped unceremoniously into a tin bowl, perhaps garnished, if you were lucky, with a clump of something that resembled bread, but may once have been a soggy doorstop. Even the coffee, if one dared call it that, had the mournful hue of watery despair. It was made from something called coffee substitute, which sounds like a polite term for disappointment brewed with resentment. Patients filed in mechanically, guided not by hunger so much as routine, moving in an orderly procession not unlike cows toward a trough. This was, in part, by design. A good Victorian asylum believed fervently in the power of routine. The idea was that regular meals, regular walks, regular sleep, everything regulated as sternly as a Victorian schoolmaster, would somehow jar the mind back into a shape socially acceptable to 19th century sensibilities. The dining hall itself was an echoing chamber of chipped enamelware and wooden spoons, punctuated by the occasional clatter of something dropped. A small rebellion, perhaps, or simply gravity reminding a patient that meals were still subject to the laws of physics. There was very little conversation. Silence was encouraged, unless you were one of the attendants, in which case your main task was to make sure nobody used cutlery for anything other than its designated purpose. Anyone caught sneaking porridge into a pocket would be carefully noted in the day's unusually thorough records. Perhaps later, they'd be prescribed a quiet sit and a stern stare from the superintendent. Though it might all sound a little joyless, and it was, the staff believed they were lending a hand in the great scientific project of the age, bringing order to chaos, routine to madness, spoonfuls of boiled wheat to the swirling gyres of the human mind. And yet, for all their noble intentions, Victorian doctors never quite got breakfast right. Even Florence Nightingale, bless her scientifically stern heart, advocated for warm broth and lightly boiled eggs in her recommendations for institutional nutrition. But those gentler menus often got slashed by budget cuts in favour of less extravagant offerings like peas pudding or dripping bread. And who could resist a serving of something called dripping bread? Spoiler, everyone. But as you sit here with us in this slightly uncomfortable wooden chair, don't worry, its back support is more aspirational than functional. You may begin to observe something odd about the architecture around you. The dining hall, like the rest of the building, was designed not just for practicality, but for moral inspiration. High ceilings and long windows were meant to uplift the mind. It was believed that architecture could be healing. The wrong shape of a lintel, the poorly placed window, these could all, apparently, stir up lunacy. And so, institutional design became a kind of psychiatric feng shui, with the assumption that a sufficiently optimistic archway might convince you to regain your senses. What the walls couldn't accomplish, though, the staff would attempt through a mix of structure and firm paternalism. Take Mr. Earnshaw, for instance, a typical asylum steward, whose moustache was so meticulously waxed it could be used to slice bread. He operated under the belief that a year of early rising, sober mealtimes, and uninterrupted knitting sessions could cure just about any mental affliction. Today, he marched past the trestle tables with his usual observant air, nodding approvingly at patients who ate without sighing and scribbling something small in his leather notebook. When one woman refused her gruel outright, that woman would be marked down as contrary and might be offered the next tier of moral recalibration, embroidery. At the far end of the room, a little window let in a pale shaft of morning light, illuminating the steam rising off the bowls in lazy, curling spirals that glowed like ghostly dancers. Outside, garden paths lay raked and severe. Walking those paths would be this afternoon's collective activity, alongside staring politely at hedges and perhaps engaging in the wildly therapeutic practice of nothing at all. And so breakfast passed, quietly, spoon by weary spoon. No one cheered, no one wept, today. And everybody's porridge was exactly as porridgey as expected. Soon, the tables would be cleared, the patients shuffled into their next predictable patch of day, and the staff would return to their ever-growing list of behavioural anomalies, many involving suspicious amounts of biscuit smuggling. But before the morning gave way to the delicate politics of communal leisure time, there was still one corner of the asylum we hadn't visited. A quieter hallway, a locked door, a room with more restraints than windows. Let's take a gentle stroll there next. The air outside the asylum often smelled fresher than it had any right to. Perhaps it was the contrast, after hours spent indoors surrounded by medicinal tinctures, mouldy wallpaper, and the faintly concerning scent of cabbage stew reheated for a fourth time. Even the most indifferent breeze felt like liberation. But for the patients of the 19th century asylum, access to that fresh air was a calculated privilege, part of something grandly called moral treatment. Ah yes, moral treatment, a philosophy as gentle-sounding as chamomile tea at bedtime, and just about as scientific. It emerged in the early 1800s as a firm rejection of chaining people to walls, which, fair enough, needed rejecting. Instead of punishment, patients were offered structure, kindness, and a healthy dollop of moral guidance. Because, of course, what one needs when gripped by delusions of grandeur is strong encouragement to take up knitting and maintain eye contact. The morning routine began early, whether you liked it or not. At approximately 5:30 a.m., a nurse with the subtlety of a brass band would swing open the heavy doors, calling everyone to rise. The goal was to avoid idleness, which was believed to invite madness, or worse, masturbation, which Victorian doctors suspected was responsible for everything from melancholia to the entire collapse of one's spinal cord. Really, the spines were dropping like flies apparently. Patients were dressed in stiff cotton uniforms, not quite pajamas, not quite school uniforms, but with all the existential discomfort of both. Hair was combed, hands were washed, and if you were very lucky, your beard wasn't shaved off as part of a misguided cleanliness campaign. Each person was expected to be presentable. Madness was one thing, but heaven forbid you were untidy. Breakfast was served precisely and consisted of foods intended to curb excitement of any kind. Coffee, out of the question. Spices, not today, Satan. We're talking porridge, the blandest possible version, and weak tea served lukewarm, lest the heat inspire revolutionary thoughts. Table manners were enforced, with the idea that teaching someone to use a fork might also untease the complicated webs of schizophrenia. It didn't, but the staff felt better nonetheless. And then came the walks. Oh, the walks. Exercise, you see, was considered vital for restoring mental balance, along with regular bowel movements, but we'll circle back to that unpleasant obsession another time. Patients were marched in neat lines through the surrounding gardens or along well-worn gravel paths. Calm promenades in nature sounded nice on paper, but in practice, many shuffled about obediently, accompanied by attendants holding keys, ledgers, and the occasional sandwich. Failure to walk properly could result in a quiet room stay, a small, often windowless chamber with minimal furniture and maximum echoes. But if you strolled just the right amount, avoided offending anyone with your existential despair, and didn't try to converse with the statue in the rose garden, again, you might be invited to take up occupational therapy. Now, that term may conjure modern images of stress balls and team-building exercises, but back in the 19th century, it meant we got you a broom, or a needle, or, if you were particularly trusted, a small saw and some poorly cut lumber. Men were assigned to farming, wood chopping, or boot repair. Women embroidered, cooked, or assisted in laundering the endless supply of linens used to mop up everything from spilled soup to spontaneous emotional outbursts. There was a rather touching belief that useful labor would restore not just the mind, but the soul. Again, noble. Again, more hopeful than accurate. But there's something oddly beautiful about the idea that someone thought a well-swept porch could ward off hallucinations, or that making muffins might lull the inner demons into a carb coma. After hours of enforced helpfulness, patients returned indoors for quiet reflection time. This might be journaling with dull pencils, reading aloud from carefully selected literature. Dickens was a staple, because if anything inspires sanity, it's 800 pages about debt, or for the illiterate, gazing into the fire while the staff read, said literature aloud. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, one of the leading minds behind the asylum reform movement, believed architecture itself could be therapeutic. His sprawling asylum design was shaped like a bat spreading its wings, calming crescents and wide hallways that curved like arms ready to embrace you, unless those arms belonged to an orderly with strong opinions about dinner etiquette. The ceilings were high, the windows tall, as though the very light could break through psychosis and illuminate the inner mind. And perhaps, just occasionally, it did. Or perhaps it simply gave the spiders more room to organize their elaborate ceiling club meetings. As dusk approached, meals were served again, the same flavorless fare, and an early bedtime was enforced. Candles snuffed, doors locked with a series of heavy clanks. Whispered prayers said, not for healing, but for peace. And as the moonlight poured softly over the great stone walls, nature's own nightlight, some patients dreamed of home, of freedom, of porridge that tasted like something. But the evenings were not always still, because just down the corridor, in the hydrotherapy wing, something dripped softly, endlessly. Let's wander there next. As the sun slipped behind the barred bottle glass windows of the asylum, its last rays filtered through the filtered air, soft, golden, but somehow still institutional. This was the hour when things quieted just enough to hear how utterly unquiet everything truly was. Somewhere down the West Wing corridor, someone was muttering to a wall in perfect iambic pentameter. A nurse, tight-bunned and tighter-lipped, tisked at a patient whose crime was not insanity, but sock thieving. And in the administrative office, Dr. Horatio Blythewood III was conducting one of his favorite end-of-day routines, methodically mislabeling a collection of unidentified herbs while sipping chamomile tea brewed with questionable water. By now, you've come to know that the 19th century insane asylum was part hospital, part social control instrument, and part, well, a Dickensian fever dream with extra corsets. Today, we turn our attention to perhaps one of the most quietly chilling features of Victorian lunacy management, the recreational therapy program. Now, I know what you're thinking. Recreational therapy? Ah yes. Painting, basket weaving, a bit of pianoforte to soothe the nerves, a spirited croquet match to lift the melancholia. Ah, if only. In most 19th century institutions, recreation was an act of benevolent misunderstanding. Physicians of the day believed that giving the mentally ill structured activity kept their minds from what was known as vicious idleness, a condition feared almost as much as licentious dancing or novel reading. Patients were frequently invited, sometimes with words, often with paddles, to participate in what could generously be called fresh air manufacturing. The asylum gardens, tended neatly by gloved administrators, were absolutely not tended by gloved administrators. They were cultivated by the inmates, who dug, weeded, and carried compost from goopy barrels with whatever tools had not been stolen or reclassified as surgical equipment. There was something almost spiritual about how manual labor was prescribed with the fervor of Holy Sacrament. Dirt, wrote one doctor in 1883, has a most salutary effect upon the melancholic soul. One can only presume he meant the therapeutic nature of gardening, and not that melancholic souls ought to be literally covered in soil. But in practice, it was often both. Inmates were assigned tasks based on their gender, prognosis, and, curiously, their perceived ability to not run away. Men were sent to the brickyard or the stables. Women were sent to the laundry, a steaming, sour-misted cavern where bedsheets went to disappear and re-emerge slightly greyer and considerably more judgmental. Both groups were promised the metaphysical gifts of industry, structure, virtue, and, though never explicitly mentioned, exhaustion. There were, occasionally, musical evenings. These occasions involved someone wheezing out hymns on a pump organ, while a room full of people judged each other's clapping rhythm. One woman from a Pennsylvania asylum recalled, in later life, that her favorite part of Tuesday evening song time was that the bats stayed mostly in the rafters. But let us not overlook the most innovative and slightly alarming form of 19th century recreation: moral entertainment. These were performances often scripted and performed by the staff, and sometimes, unnervingly, the more compliant patients. They touched on virtues such as temperance, obedience, and the ever-popular narrative arc of being mildly disobedient and then terribly sorry. Picture the scene: a dimly lit parlor full of asylum residents, seated in rows of chairs salvaged from train station waiting rooms. The head nurse opens the curtain. It's an old horse blanket, revealing Mr. Parsnip, the maintenance man, dressed as Vice. He stumbles about dramatically while someone narrates his sins, probably involving too much punch and not enough prayer. At the end, he repents, and everyone claps, or at least nods toward the concept of clapping, and thus concludes another therapeutic evening at the Asylum Players Repertory Theatre. These activities were based on the idea of moral treatment, a term that sounds noble in 19th century handwriting, but often translated into a mix of ambient guilt, performative industry, and long walks under supervision. It wasn't entirely ineffective. Some patients did report enjoying the opportunity to walk among the trees or spend their afternoons drawing hazy portraits of birds that may or may not have actually existed. Still, the divide between recreation and quiet compliance was razor thin. After all, what constitutes a healthy pastime in an environment where your shoelaces are considered contraband? As the night deepened and the oil lamps flickered behind the grates, the sounds of the recreational day gave way to the hush of sleep medication and whispered prayers that were at once hopeful and a little bureaucratic. And just like that, the asylum settled into its twilight state, a place where imagination and regulation met in uneasy partnership, and the evening's motto hung invisibly in the air: "You're not here for fun, but you might just accidentally have some." Soon, we'll take a peek into something even more curious than entertainment in the asylum: the food. Because nothing quite says healing mental distress like turnip porridge served with a hint of existential dread. One of the most curious sights in a 19th century asylum, besides the fact that everyone seemed to be wearing corsets, whether they needed to breathe or not, was the stunning array of treatments administered with the confidence usually reserved for miracle cures or snake oil, which, coincidentally, the doctors were also quite fond of. Once you entered the great vaulted halls of a Victorian-era institution, with their cathedral-like ceilings and suspiciously sticky floors, you would almost certainly be treated to one of these glittering gems of pseudoscientific brilliance: the tranquilizer chair. Now, the term tranquilizer may inspire visions of peaceful naps or calming herbal teas. Sadly, the actual item was a wooden monstrosity designed by none other than Benjamin Rush, a celebrated physician who, bless his well-meaning heart, believed that motion of any kind was the true source of madness. Picture a chair, a very large chair, a very, very annoying chair. Imagine sitting in this chair, your arms, legs, and head restrained so tightly that sneezing would require a team of staff and perhaps divine intervention. You would sit there, completely immobilized, for hours, sometimes days. And if you tried to protest, your diet might shift to soft bread and the occasional soothing broth. Not for comfort, mind you, but because chewing was considered entirely too stimulating. The logic, if one can use that word, was that absolute stillness could soothe the frantic fluids of the mind, because naturally, everyone knew back then that insanity was caused by imbalances of bile. Of course, silly us. No wonder we've gone mad with oat milk these days. And while our friend the tranquilizer chair might sound like the lowest point of mental health care, oh no, the good doctors weren't done yet. Some favoured the spinning chair. Yes, another chair, but this one was more lively. You'd be tied in and spun around rapidly, a bit like a jury-rigged carnival ride on a particularly demented farm. The goal was to reset the brain, much like one might shake an Etch-A sketch, except with less artistic finesse and more vomiting. Researchers of the time, with furrowed brows and impressive mutton chops, internally debated whether the spinning should be clockwise or counterclockwise, a debate we can assume they lost somewhere around the first case of projectile nausea reaching an oil painting. Now, if spinning didn't cure what ailed you, perhaps a cold water bath would. Hydrotherapy, as it was grandly called, was all the rage across Europe and America. In theory, cold water was believed to shock the brain into reason. In practice, patients were submerged in bathtubs filled with frigid water for hours at a time, sometimes restrained under soaked sheets so they didn't float away, or, rather more likely, try to escape. It would be unfair not to mention that there was, beneath all the misguided methods, a genuine belief that this was helping. Doctors truly thought they were restoring balance to the mind and not slowly freezing someone's sanity along with their extremities. Now, if you happen to be a hysterical woman, always the most fashionable diagnosis for ladies under stress, you might undergo ovarian compression, a charming procedure where sandbags were placed on your abdomen to quell womb-related lunacy. That's right, someone at some point pondered a distressed woman and thought, yes, what this lady needs is a decent abdominal squashing. That should do it. The 19th century was particularly creative in its approach to medicine. You couldn't lace up your boots without tripping over someone with a theory involving magnets, mustache wax, or phrenology, the already debunked belief that skull bumps could reveal your personality. Asylums became laboratories of strange ambition, where gift horses were not only looked in the mouth, but given leeches for good measure. Through it all, one can't help but see a kind of earnest absurdity that danced through every darkened corridor of those institutions. The belief that madness could be located, targeted, and subdued through the sheer willpower of furniture and chill. As twilight deepens and the halls fall quiet, our story drifts toward another corridor, this one lined not with treatments, but with shadows, and secrets scribbled in forgotten notebooks. The mattress, if one dares to call it that, was a tribute to the art of disappointment. It sagged in every place except the parts that jabbed, stuffed not with feathers or even straw, but with something sorrowfully referred to as excelsior. Curled shavings of wood that sounded charming but felt like bedding down in a carpenter's scrap pile. Welcome to the sleeping accommodations of a typical 19th century insane asylum, a place where rest was technically encouraged, though not particularly well engineered. The philosophy was simple. A clear mind comes from a calm body, and a calm body sleeps well, at least in theory. In practice, calming the body often involved things like woolen restraints, cold baths, and occasionally being forgotten in a hallway after supper. But put that aside for now. Let's imagine the sleeping quarters themselves. You might picture long rows of iron-framed beds, painted in hospital white, or a greyish hue best described as despair chic. Linens were issued weekly, presumably by someone wearing both a frown and an apron. Sheets were thin, stiff, and took on the smell of their environment, the scent, in this case, being an aromatic blend of mildew, starch, and institutional regret. Now, not every patient had the privilege of a bed. Some, considered too agitated or unpredictable, were ushered into single-occupancy rooms with walls more padded than welcoming. These safety rooms varied in quality, with some boasting thick straw coverings on the floor, while others simply provided a cot and mute indifference. Insomnia, as it turns out, was considered both a symptom and a cause of madness. So naturally, custodians of the asylum had a vested interest in helping everyone drift peacefully into whatever passed for sleep under those grey ward ceilings. Remedies included warm milk, long lectures, monotonous scripture readings, or, for particularly difficult cases, a mild sedative laced with something that might have been opium or might have been whiskey. No one was quite sure anymore, but the important thing was that it made people quiet. The nighttime attendants, shuffling down the dim corridors in crepe-soled shoes, carried lanterns and clipboards. They paused outside doors, listening for outbursts or unsettling silence. Too much noise was bad, but so was no noise at all. Asylum logic was endearingly inconsistent that way. If you were awake, they wondered why. If you slept too deeply, they poked you to make sure you hadn't taken sleep's final curtain call. And for those with night terrors, oh dear. Physicians theorized that dreams could indicate all manner of mental disruption. A recurring nightmare about cats might mean unresolved neurosis, screaming in your sleep, possibly something more serious, a haunted conscience or poorly digested supper. Treatment might include gentle murmured reassurances if you were lucky, or more often, a nighttime application of the dreaded wet sheet wrap, a treatment that involved soaking a bedsheet in cold water, wrapping the poor dreamer like a tightly swaddled burrito, and waiting for either calm or a noble surrender to hypothermia. Still, some reported sleeping surprisingly well, despite it all. The schedule was predictable. Early lights out, early wake up, a bell rung with military precision. And there is something perhaps comforting in knowing nothing will surprise you at 3 a.m. Except the occasional overzealous nurse who mistook your restorative, nap for unconscious rebellion. Of course, proper ventilation was a rare feature in most 19th century asylum dormitories. Windows were small, often barred, and rarely opened. The air was thick, warm in summer, and stiff with the scent of humanity. It wasn't just the bodies, it was the books, the ink, the furniture, the decade-old varnish, a pungent perfume of preservation and confinement. And as you lay there, on that scratchy sheet, over that itchy mattress, listening to distant coughs and muttered prayers from neighboring beds, your mind might begin to wander, just as many minds did, night after night, under the barely flickering gaslight glow. Was that noise a rat? Or just one of the attendants crunching his nightly biscuit? Was the woman 3 beds over truly asleep, or lost in a conversation only she could hear? And would the ceiling always creak like that? Or was it simply the building sighing in resignation? Sleep would come eventually, if not by comfort, then by the sheer exhaustion of existing in a place so endlessly peculiar. But before we drift off entirely, let us take a quiet walk down that corridor ahead, the one where a different kind of patient waits. Not loud, not violent, but still, wrapped not in sheets, but in stories. It is a truth universally acknowledged by anyone who has ever glanced at a 19th century asylum ledger or clutched a rickety kerosene lamp during stormy introspection. That fresh air would surely heal what troubled you, or so the doctors said. And by fresh air, of course, they meant an hour of being marched around in circles like a group of melancholy ducklings. Yes, this was something grandly referred to as moral treatment, and in principle, it was revolutionary. In practice, it sometimes felt more like a very drab field trip with no snacks. In the early to mid-1800s, asylums began embracing the idea that patients, then called the insane, the melancholic, or, most curiously, lunatics, were not moral failures, but simply out of balance, emotionally disjointed, like a harp missing a string or a soup missing its salt. Which is why, before you were strapped or scraped or submerged, you were often encouraged, nay, gently ordered, to engage in something called curative occupation. Translation: keeping busy so you didn't have time to be mad. There were needlepoint baskets handed to the women and gardening trowels offered to the men, because, as the medical logic went, it was surely impossible to hear voices if you were too busy pulling weeds. Of course, not all patients were capable or willing participants in this genteel industriousness. Some preferred solitude, others threw their embroidery hoops at the walls. But the asylum authorities persisted, convinced that honest labor could soothe unsettled minds. Now, if you were particularly fortunate or ominously interesting, you might be assigned a post in the asylum theatre. Yes, theatre, with costumes. It wasn't Phantom of the Opera, but it was a dazzling production of Please Just Let Someone Clap Today. Not merely therapeutic, but reputational. These performances were proudly reported in local newspapers. Audiences of uneasy townsfolk would come watch lunatics recite Shakespeare or perform musical numbers, all to prove that the asylum wasn't a house of horrors, but a haven of healing. A bit like watching your aunt's cats do ballet, because they're very gifted actually. One 1870s asylum director noted that performances dramatically improved patients' deportment, which is to say, people temporarily forgot to gnash their teeth or bite the stagehands. A small win, but a win nonetheless. Then there were the gardens. Ah, the gardens. To modern eyes, they seem dreamy. Rows of geraniums, winding paths through trimmed hedges, the occasional trellis for dramatic sighing. But these weren't so much tranquil spaces as they were leafy enclosures, designed for physical pacification. A peaceful inmate was a manageable one, after all. Some asylums even constructed faux villages on site, little shops, farms, or post offices, where patients could feel a part of a functioning world. It was like the Truman Show, but with corsets and chloral hydrate. This approach had a charming name, the village asylum model. The idea was that through normalcy, structure, and pleasant deception, patients might be gently coaxed back to reality. And if reality refused to be coaxed, there were always more walks. The only problems were, well, winter, rain, and the deeply embedded societal belief that madness grew from moral rot. Thus, for all the flower picking and fife playing, there lurked a quiet judgment shaped like a rosary. Patients were awarded privileges for obedience and slipped into seclusion for disobedience. Seclusion being a polite way to say, we locked you in a mostly empty room until you got less spirited. And so, the daily rhythm became a sort of tragic pageantry. Get up, straighten your cot, attend chapel, do basket weaving or dig up potatoes, march in formation around the yard, clap politely at a play, say you feel better, repeat. There's something almost tender in the attempt. The hard hope baked into structured days and wholesome distractions. But underneath it all was a brittle truth. Despite the terminology, these treatments often weren't about curing. They were about coping and about controlling. Tidy minds, tidy schedules, tidy patience. Eventually, of course, things would shift again. Methods would harden, science would intervene. But for now, at this soft, in-between moment, the asylum was still trying to be lovely. Shall we slide into the shadows of the next corridor, where some treatments wore white coats and others wore smirks? The food, dear listener. Oh, the curious culinary catastrophe that awaited our poor Victorian patients each time the dinner bell clanged somewhere down the dim hallway. If you thought tapioca pudding was a crime against modern taste buds, just wait until you sample the 19th century asylum version, a beige mystery meant to be nourishing, but possibly summoned from the depths of a bland purgatory. In most asylums of the time, meals weren't so much a repast as they were a ritual exercise in institutional efficiency. The food had two purposes: to keep bodies barely running and to fit neatly into budgets smaller than a Victorian waistline. Oatmeal gruel was a fan favourite, of course, served cold and thick enough to mortar bricks. It wasn't uncommon for patients to eat the same meal 3 times a day, which is perfect if your lifelong dream is to slowly become a homogeneous porridge yourself. Now, don't be fooled by the occasional appearance of meat. Boiled beef may sound like sustenance, but in these halls it was rarely recognizable as anything that had once roamed a field. It was a colorless lump, as if even the cow had lost the will to chew during preparation. Meat was often so overcooked that it achieved the paradoxical texture of being both soggy and rubbery at once, a culinary magic trick that left jaws sore and hearts heavier. Vegetables were technically on the menu too, but more as a gesture than a contribution toward health. Turnips were popular because they were cheap, plentiful, and incapable of offering joy. Often cooked into submission or disintegrated entirely, they were served in soups that tasted like wet sock memories and in stews resembling sad vegetable confetti. Butter was rationed. Salt was a luxury. And spices, please. That's the kind of rebellious seasoning that led to revolutions. The Board of Lunacy, yes, a real thing, kept a careful eye on expenses. After all, this was a fine balance between care and control. And if you accidentally gave the patients cayenne pepper, who knows what senses it could awaken? Better, they thought, to dull the experience of eating down to the palate of a rain cloud. But somewhere, perhaps in the back of the institution's sprawling kitchen, amid coal stoves and iron pots, there might be a sliver of humanity. A nurse with flour on her hands might sneak an extra spoonful of molasses into the brown bread. A kitchen aide, quietly defiant, might tuck a slightly bruised apple into the fold of a shawl, slipping it to a favorite patient during the afternoon walk. These glimmers, tucked between the boiled cabbage and mealy apples, remind us that kindness often survives even the grimmest institutional design. And speaking of design, imagine the dining halls themselves. Long, echoing chambers filled with rows of sturdy wooden tables bolted to the floor. There was little space for private conversation or joyful chewing. Meals were eaten in silence under the watchful eyes of attendants, their presence less about etiquette and more about order. Even chewing too loudly might draw attention. Best to humbly sip your gruel and remain anonymous, like an oat ghost among the living. Patients were sometimes encouraged to raise complaints about meals. These complaints went precisely nowhere. Suggestions were collected in neat little logs, read aloud perhaps once per quarter, and then filed away politely into the not going to happen drawer. It's touching, really, how Victorian bureaucracy maintained the appearance of care. To be fair, however, some institutions made honest attempts at nutrition. Fresh milk, seasonal vegetables, even jam if the budget allowed. The model asylum movement did encourage cleanliness, order, and, at least on paper, a decent diet. But the gap between policy and practice was as wide as an untouched dinner plate. Imagine then, drifting to sleep each night with your belly filled just enough, but never full. A belly that had grown used to gruel moonrises and beef dusk. Comfort was rationed, but fatigue did the rest. And somewhere out there, during the quiet hours when spoons had fallen silent and ovens had grown cold, a wandering rat might discover a forgotten crust beneath a grease-stained table. And for one small moment, even the rodent feasted better than the patients. Now, close your eyes and wander with me down the hall one more time. Not toward the dinner bell, no. Tonight, we'll glide softly toward another of the institution's grand foundations, the peculiar art of restraint. But hush, let the hall settle first. Let sleep ripple through the walls like soup steam beneath a heavy door. By the flickering glow of gas lamps and the restless mutter of wind against stone, the asylum's clock ticked its own strange poetry. Most institutions of the 19th century tried, at least in theory, to run on schedules, meal times, medicine times, bathing times, punishment times, and yet, within the limestone walls of some brooding facility in Massachusetts or New York, time, with a capital T, became a more interpretive concept. Sleep, for instance, was only gently respected. Yes, beds were provided, largely rigid, many suspiciously splinter-prone, but sleep was not always restful. Men and women were often jolted awake at odd hours for cold water treatments or sudden experimental checkups, because nothing says rejuvenation like a bucket of chilly optimism poured over your face at 3:15 a.m. But let's take a moment, dear listener, to gently pull aside the threadbare curtain of night and peer into the asylum's infamous midnight inspections. These were, believe it or not, intended as a form of security and health checking. Attendants would shuffle silently through halls like poorly lit ghosts, clutching their oil lamps and ledgers. They'd peer into each room, not so much to help, mind you, but to ensure no one had staged a narrow escape using a spoon and their one remaining shoelace. If the patient was sleeping peacefully, excellent. If the patient was not, well, Dr. Curiosity would be consulted in the morning. Rooms were typically single or double occupancy affairs, furnished with all the cozy charm of a medieval broom closet. Iron bed frames creaked like professional mourners, and blankets were military issue. Scratchy, honest wool that could exfoliate or embolden, depending on your skin's enthusiasm. Pillows were sparse or absent. Some believed that a soft pillow might give the delirious ideas. What ideas? Well, no one was entirely sure, but it was best to be cautious. And the lullabies of the ward. Less Brahms, more screams, murmurs, and the occasional clanking of a chamber pot. You see, chamber pots were communal in nature, or worse, absent, forcing a late-night shuffle to the necessary room, which was often a brisk walk down a shadowy hallway guarded by pure hope and weak candles. A lucky few, usually the more tranquil patients, which meant anyone not currently inventing conspiracy theories involving soup, were permitted access to quieter sections of the institution. Some even had windows, albeit small and barred, where moonlight might drop shyly across the floor. Speaking of moonlight, let's talk about moon-based theories. In many asylums, particularly in the earlier part of the century, it was believed that the full moon caused madness to spike, hence the term lunatic, from lunar. On nights when the moon was large and cheeky, staff would patrol more vigorously, hands gripped tightly on their medicine keys, and the vague fear that someone, somewhere, might try to both escape and yodel. Therapeutically, sleep was considered crucial, but unstable. One Dr. Pliny Earle, a pioneer in mental health reform, and not, unfortunately, a pirate, argued that a good night's sleep was more useful than a dozen blue pills and 3 sharp bitter tonics. But getting a good night's sleep required more than theory. It required bedding, quiet, dignity, and for the celery broth at dinner not to have mystery floating objects. Let's not forget the fashion of nightwear. Patients were typically clothed in long, drab gowns made from unyielding cotton blends that resembled the attire of an emotionally exhausted ghost. Comfort was secondary to uniformity. After all, if everyone looked equally disheveled, there'd be fewer who stood out. This was thought to promote equality of morale, or at least mutual confusion. Occasionally, the night staff, tired, underpaid, and frequently questioning their life choices, would read aloud from a Bible or a moral tract to any patient lingering too close to the hallway. Not exactly a bedtime story, but it beat silence. And so, the night crept on. Inside those cold corridors, time curved and bent. Minutes dissolved into hours in the mind, and the world outside faded like a dream someone else was having. The rain might tap gently against windows, or the snow pile up silently against the sills. But within, sleep came in fragmented, peace, half dream, half vigil. Some slumbered, some lay wide-eyed in shadow, and a few, always the same few, whispered softly to things only they could see. Tomorrow would bring morning rounds and medicinal theories. But for now, as the asylum muttered through its midnight hours, everything was bathed in that strange, muffled quiet unique to places where rest is encouraged, but never guaranteed. We'll follow that quiet, down another hallway, past a rusting stove and 3 snoring orderlies, and see what waits on the other side of sleep. At the heart of every 19th century asylum, beyond the barred windows and the curious echoes, lay something truly spectral: the treatment rooms. And oh, dear listener, I hope you're comfortably snuggled in bed, because the so-called treatments we're about to explore are best experienced from a safe distance of at least 150 years and one memory foam pillow away. Now, let's dim the gas lights and tiptoe into the medical wing, a place where science, optimism, and sheer creative audacity collided in velvet-draped consultation chambers. The physicians of the time, and I use the word physicians here with all appropriate squinting, did their utmost to extract cures from a medical toolkit that operated on equal parts guesswork and theatre. Take, for instance, the mysterious art of hydrotherapy. While it sounds like the sort of luxurious spa day you'd get with cucumber slices on your eyes, hydrotherapy in the 1800s asylum context was less relaxation and more hostile plumbing. Patients were gently but persistently submerged in lukewarm water for hours, or tucked into sheets soaked in cold water, then bound up like damp burritos. The idea was to calm the nerves, though the practical outcome was often more along the lines of mild hypothermia and a deep distrust of bathtubs. And then we must pay homage to the rotating chair. In concept, a simple device. A wooden chair, suspended from the ceiling, with a rope, spun in wide, rapid loops like a carnival ride designed by someone both very confident and very bored. Originally devised by Erasmus Darwin. Yes, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who clearly had an evolving sense of fun. The rotating chair was believed to calm mania by regulating blood flow. Patients could be spun for minutes at a time, which was either invigorating or extraordinarily nausea-inducing, depending on your constitution and what you'd eaten for breakfast. Now, if spinning didn't help, perhaps a little electricity would. Yes, electrotherapy, the lightning of the early asylum experience. Small towers with wires were placed beside patients, and low-voltage currents gently ushered into the body to stimulate nerves and coax better behavior. It was the Victorian version of turning something off and back on again. A flicker of current across the temple might have been seen as a reawakening of rational thought, or tragically, just a good way to frizz your hair and be slightly more bewildered than before. And dear listener, shall we whisper of leeches? Ah yes, those devoted little creatures, praised by doctors for their dedication to sucking. Bloodletting was viewed as a noble balancing of the body's humours, a kind of internal house cleaning as it were. A touch too melancholic, slap on a few leeches behind the ears. Not feeling sociable enough, leech the temple. And while the patient may have felt a little tired and perhaps personally offended, after the treatment, the doctors beamed with satisfaction. Of course, there were the stalwarts of moral therapy, which theorized, quite radically for the time, that talking to patients as if they were human beings might actually help. Activities like gardening, painting, and walking among the daisies were encouraged. Conversations were held. Empathy was attempted. A rather wild idea, really. Humane treatment, nestled like a brave little flower between the puddles of cold water and the sparking machines. And let us not forget the regular dosing of opiates, chloral hydrate, and a mysterious tonic called soothing syrup. A concoction so calming it practically erased one's ability to remember where one was, or why one had ever come to such a peculiar institution in the first place. The lines between treatment and tranquility were often thin, cloudy, and lightly opium-scented. Every remedy, no matter how curious, was applied with utter seriousness. The doctors wore impressive moustaches and peered thoughtfully over their pince-nez as they charted outcomes with ink-stained fingers. Patients were catalogued in longhand, less agitated after fourth water immersion, though now prone to shivering and poetic muttering. And through all this, the asylum moved like a strange dream, where intentions were good, methods were experimental, and reality was always slightly sideways. Now, as you drift deeper into your own warm blankets and settle more comfortably into stillness, we'll leave behind the clinks of the treatment tools, the swirling chairs, and the somewhat alarming smell of chloroform and liniment oil. For in some quiet corner of the asylum's courtyard, shaded by ivy and thyme, another piece of the story waits patiently, its shoes tied neatly, its hat slightly askew, and its secrets just beginning to stir in the late afternoon breeze. Somewhere between the rattle of keys and the slosh of mop water, Wednesday mornings brought what the asylum politely called hydrotherapy. To be clear, this had little to do with a relaxing spa day and absolutely nothing to do with cucumbers on the eyes. But in the 19th century, if you managed to say 3 melancholy things in a row or failed to smile too long in public, you might find yourself briskly escorted into a room full of tilting tubs, rubber hoses, and attendants who looked like they'd never met a bath they didn't weaponize. Water, the old physicians insisted, had curative powers. A chill plunge could shock the mania out, while a steaming wrap might soothe the hysteria. Both used liberally and with a frequency that rarely resembled a medical consensus. The strapping in was part of the charm. You were not so much bathed as you were marinated. Imagine, for instance, the continuous bath, a large coffin-shaped tub filled with body temperature water, in which patients might float, strapped wrist to thigh, for several hours or days. Yes, days. Under the theory, it would mellow their nerves. You'd be draped with a sheet to preserve modesty, though your dignity may have wandered off somewhere long before the second hour. Sometimes a canvas lid was placed on top of the tub, with only your head poking out, helpfully ensuring you didn't do anything rebellious, like stretch or blink too enthusiastically. Then there was the shower chair. Picture a wooden throne, which sounds promising, until you notice it's fitted with iron restraints and fixed beneath a spout. A patient would be seated, affixed like an unusually damp monarch, and then doused with pummeling jets of cold water, all in the name of resetting their mental disposition. Angry, anxious, just a little too excitable after lunch. Well then, a brisk indoor thunderstorm ought to sort that out. Of course, not every hydrotherapy session was a scene from a Dickensian bathtub horror novella. Sometimes patients simply sat in warm baths, loosely supervised by caretakers who mostly tried not to make eye contact. It had a spa-like ambience, if you completely reimagined what the word spa meant, and also removed scented candles, silence and empathy. The theories behind all of this were surprisingly heartfelt. Water, after all, flows. It cleanses. It reflects. It's always moving but also still. Mysterious but essential. Physicians sincerely believed that immersing the troubled mind in water's elemental embrace might invite tranquility, and in a few rare cases, it even seemed to help. There are 19th century records of patients reporting calm after long soaks. Of course, at that point, anyone would say they felt calm if it meant getting out of a wrinkly prison disguised as a bathtub. By the late 1800s, hydrotherapy had more sophisticated champions. Some doctors began to log temperatures, chart patient responses, and, dare we say, attempt a smidge of science. Yet it still meandered somewhere between medicine and performance art. There was, for instance, the douche massage, which sounds oddly upscale, until you realize it's a forceful stream of water aimed at your spinal column, with all the subtlety of a garden hose in revolt. It wasn't all gloom and mildew, though. In certain institutions, typically the better funded ones, often perched in the gentle embrace of countryside hilltops, hydrotherapy evolved into something gentler. Patients were given privacy, consistency, and the occasional chamomile infusion. Water became a ritual of rhythm, a quiet pulse, a kind of tide washing over the restless mind. But mostly, in the average asylum, hydrotherapeutic routines walked that delicate line between well-meaning and wildly ill-advised, a line that many Victorian institutions cartwheeled over in wet slippers. Still, for all its peculiarities, water was one of the least invasive regimens available. No plunging instruments, no galvanic belts or suspicious tonics, just water, which, given the rest of the treatment menu, puts it oddly high on the list of things you wouldn't entirely dread. And so, as the sun sets over the rustling maples outside our creaking old institution, and as the last echoes of sloshed buckets fade into a sleepy hush, we dry our feet, roll down the twitching sleeves of 60-pound linen bath wraps, and wander gently onward. Because, well, there was always something next, usually just down the corridor, past the locked drawer, near the matron's mysterious cabinet marked for moral therapy use only. If there were ever an Olympic event for most questionably therapeutic activities disguised as medical treatment, the 19th century insane asylum would have swept the podium, doused it in laudanum, and then prescribed it hydrotherapy twice daily. And nowhere were these gilded medical misadventures more creatively misapplied than in the dubious domain of, drumroll please, moral treatment. Ah yes, moral treatment. The name sounds polite enough, like something you might receive at a countryside retreat with herbal tea and a pamphlet on personal growth. But in a 19th century asylum, moral treatment was the centerpiece of psychiatric philosophy, and like many things that sound good on a brass plaque, it offered more polish than practicality. At its heart, moral treatment was rooted in the belief that mentally ill patients could be restored to reason through a well-ordered life, structured routine, and mild manners. Not altogether a bad idea, you might say. The problem, dear listener, lay in the execution, which vacillated somewhere between Victorian etiquette class and puritanical summer camp, a regimen of early breakfasts, compulsory knitting, and forced smiles. You can practically feel the dusty oppression riding in on a lace doily. Patients were encouraged to behave with propriety. This meant walking with purpose, speaking only when spoken to, and above all, not causing a fuss. Manners, it seemed, were next to godliness. Misbehavior wasn't seen as a symptom. It was a moral failing. If you tossed your dinner tray at the wall, the staff might conclude you lacked discipline rather than underlying stability. In the asylum, chaos was inconvenient, and thus cured with curt instruction. Work, of course, was considered especially medicinal. For male patients, this might involve tending gardens, sewing burlap sacks, or breaking rocks into gravel with the kind of therapeutic intensity only available through repetitive manual labor. Ladies, meanwhile, often found themselves sewing or laundering endlessly, as if the path to psychological clarity lay directly through starched linens and embroidery hoops. Nothing said mental wellness like stitching pillowcases until your hallucinations got bored and left. Now, this might seem cruel, and yes, it often was. But here's the curious part. Moral treatment was in many ways a vast improvement over the dungeon-like conditions of earlier centuries, where treatment mostly consisted of chains, ice baths, and leeches with trust issues. Moral treatment marked a shift from brute force to behavioral reshaping. It was, in theory, about patient dignity. Indeed, some asylums banned mechanical restraints completely, favouring calm persuasion over cold iron. It was less about caging the body and more about softly imprisoning the soul in a corset of civility. Staff were instructed to act with kindness, which in the 19th century might include addressing patients with their titles, Mr. Thompson rather than lunatic in room 3, and gently reminding them to finish their porridge with decorum. A successful ward looked like a manicured tea party, where nobody acknowledged the hallucinating baron in the corner talking to a fireplace. But, and isn't there always one of those, moral treatment only really worked in settings with very few patients, lots of staff, and plenty of resources. Things which, as one might guess, declined rapidly as asylums filled to the rafters with the cognitively unruly and the inconveniently poor. And so moral treatment often devolved into performance art. Overworked staff going through the motions, applying cheerfulness like wallpaper pasted over cracks in the plaster. Polish the brass, fix the doilies, make sure the patients don't scream during visiting hours. Just another Tuesday at the institution. In some places, patients who refused to conform to the rigid schedule were disciplined in ironically unmoral ways: solitary confinement, cold water dousing, or the ever-ominous medicated lunch, which, to be clear, was neither appetizing nor consensual. Still, for all its flaws, the era of moral treatment reflects a peculiar historical optimism, a time when people believed mad minds could be mended like broken watches through routine, politeness, and perhaps a spot of flower arranging. It was misguided, certainly, but not wholly without heart. The intention often shimmered above the chaos, like a gaslight flickering in a dusty corridor. A little warm, a little dim, yet notably better than dark. And as shadows lengthen across the ward, and the gramophone sighs its final notes of the evening, the asylum prepares for another night of restorative quiet, interrupted only occasionally by unquiet minds. But what did night in the asylum truly look like, when the lamps dimmed and dreams, delusions, and distant footsteps took center stage? Well, that is a mystery best explored under a lull of moonlight. In the long and echoing hallways of America's 19th century asylums, there stood a curious presence beside the doctors, nurses, and unfortunate inmates. A figure both feared and revered. The asylum superintendent. Picture, if you like, a man of stiff collar and even stiffer whiskers. His job title implied a sort of high-minded wisdom, but somewhere between the paperwork, the pipe smoke, and the habit of quoting Galen mid-sentence, things got theatrical. For much of the century, the superintendent wasn't just the boss. Oh no, he was the philosopher king of the asylum, lord of all lunacy, wielder of both pen and paddle. In many institutions, he lived on site, typically in a stately house attached to the building, often furnished with rather suspicious comforts, considering how sparse things were for the patients. Think Persian rugs, hand-carved furnishings, and portraits of men with much better handwriting than yours. Now, the job of asylum superintendent was not simply to enforce order or authorize treatment. It was to embody the very belief system of the asylum. Back when moral treatment was in vogue, an approach that believed kindness and well-swept corridors could cure mental illness, the superintendent was expected to be a kind of paragon of balance and reason, the emotional thermostat of a building full of psychic turbulence. And so, voila, he became everything. Part host of the world's most unfortunate dinner party, part disciplinarian, part philosopher, and full-time keeper of secrets. Many superintendents even kept meticulously detailed personal journals, in which they recorded the number of window panes broken by Mrs. E, the number of times Mr. H attempted to abscond through the laundry chute, and occasionally poetry, bad poetry. Yet for all his lofty ideals, the superintendent could also be, let's say, alarmingly human. His authority was nearly absolute behind the gates. He approved admissions, he determined treatment plans, and of course he decided who was sane enough to leave. So if he developed a weird affection for one patient's recitations of Shakespeare, or an irrational vendetta against another's habit of grooming pigeons indoors, well, so be it. Superintendent Thomas Story Kirkbride, for example, is a man whose name you wouldn't expect to know, but who personally redesigned the architecture of your suffering. His Kirkbride plan dictated that asylum buildings should resemble palaces, light-filled corridors, fresh air, separate wings for varying severity of illness. It was meant to inspire calm, healing, and architectural awe. And oh, they did, at first glance, until you noticed that the building, like the doctor who ran it, was beautiful in a way that insisted too much on its own virtue. Kirkbride buildings became a sensation, but they were monstrously expensive. Each new wing ballooned beyond budgets, and some superintendents turned into real estate impresarios, lobbying for more funds with the solemnity of a Shakespearean monologue. Forsooth, how can we cure madness without a proper solarium? They also dabbled in an odd genre of literature, the annual reports. These plump, dignified volumes were penned by the superintendents each year and sent off to the state with great fanfare. In them, you'd find census numbers, death rates, an enthusiastic mention of new wallpaper in the female ward, and at least one overly optimistic remark about the recent success of hydrotherapy. The prose was florid beyond measure. Reading these reports was not unlike being tucked in by someone who only speaks in metaphors, but the most charming, if slightly chilling, aspect of the superintendent's role was his belief, wholehearted and in retrospect rather naive, that order itself was curative, that if one could simply keep the hedges clipped, the silverware counted, and the chairs aligned precisely in the parlour, sanity would float gently downward like a feather in a Jane Austen novel. Of course, it also meant that any deviation from order, patients pacing, arguing with the sun, refusing to starch their collar, felt like a moral failure of the entire endeavour. And so, order became obsession. Obsessed institutions need obsessed leaders, and our old friend, the superintendent, happily obliged. Sometimes they fell ill, sometimes they left, sometimes they snapped. One famously vanished from his own asylum, never to be seen again, leaving behind only his coat, his inkwell, and the lingering scent of frustration. Eventually, the public began to question the unchecked rule of these monarchs of madness. Medicine evolved, the field professionalized, and the all-knowing, all-seeing superintendent slowly lost his throne, his pipe, and his peculiar home next to the East Wing. But, oh, for a time, his word was law and his mustache was justice. Now, let's draw the curtains on our superintendent's office, where the lamp still burns low beside a half-finished report. Ahead, through the hush of twilight corridors, something far more peculiar waits in the next room, where treatment turns from theory to water. Contrary to what your modern sensibilities might suggest, the 19th century asylum wasn't all echoey corridors and unsettling whispering. Sometimes it was laundry day. Terribly riveting, I know. But stick with me, because in the grand ballet of institutional routine, laundry, yes, laundry, was a cornerstone of moral rehabilitation. And socks, lots and lots of socks, in those cavernous buildings of ordered madness, filled with squeaky boots and the occasional accidental electroshock, The Asylum laundry room was its own peculiar theatre of dreams, steam rising from copper boiling vats, rows of damp linens flapping like ghostly surrender flags, and a cast of patients enlisted to wash, starch, fold, repeat. All under the immortal gaze of supervising matrons whose aprons had more starch than their smiles. This wasn't just about hygiene, mind you, although few things scream institutional morale booster like crisp, aggressively bleached bed linens. Laundry work was considered therapeutic, a principle of what was then deemed moral treatment. The idea was that structured labor, tidily performed, might gently lead one back from the shores of inner disarray. No pressure, of course, just wash these 30 gowns and maybe find your sanity along the way. The theories behind this were wildly optimistic. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, part asylum architect, part armchair philosopher, firmly believed that a clean environment promoted a clean mind. His famous asylum design, the Kirkbride Plan, emphasized fresh air, natural light, and order. It was architecture as therapy, which is a lovely idea until you realize how quickly even the brightest corridors fell into institutional gloom, especially when the budget ran out midway through construction. Glass ceilings only, work when they've got, well, glass. But back to those who folded more than just sheets. The patients directed to laundry rooms were not necessarily the most stable. They were just the most manageable. You didn't have to be cured to wring out pillowcases, just unlikely to wring out your co-worker. Supervisors selected their favorites, usually the quiet ones, or those who said, "Yes, ma'am," without too much existential weeping. It was, in many ways, a strange sort of favoritism that rewarded docility with steam burns and soggy hands. Laundry rooms were also social theatres of a very odd kind. Conversations happened, both whispered and loud enough for matronly correction. Stories were shared. Boredom was alleviated. Occasionally, there was singing, though not always in key and not always by choice. There's something endearingly surreal about a room full of women belting out hymns while scrubbing someone else's underthings. It was community of a kind. A little off-kilter, a little waterlogged, but very real. This, of course, was all unpaid labor. A rather generous definition of therapy, if ever there was one. But administrators wrote glowing notes about how industrious this made the patients, how useful they felt, how splendid their folding technique had become. No mention of the scalded forearms or soap-chapped fingertips. Notes from inspectors would praise the cheerful atmosphere of the laundry hall, though one imagines how many smiles were nervous ones. You might wonder if anyone found peace amidst the hiss of boiling vats and the odor of institutional starch. And the answer is, sort of. For some, the routine was soothing, predictable, a rhythm in a world that otherwise offered very little personal control. Folding towels turned out to be more effective in grounding one's thoughts than many of the experimental treatments of the era. At least, it didn't involve ice baths or chair restraints. And even in this soapy, steamy environment, what passed for tiny rebellions fluttered now and then. An intentionally mismatched pair of socks, a towel folded inside out, a hymn sung ever so slightly out of tempo. Quiet revolts performed in the key of domesticity. There's something quietly haunting in imagining these women, and occasionally men, hunched over their suds, scrubbing at linen while scrubbing at the very edges of who they used to be. The scent of lye in the air, the clang of the mangle, and always the sense that laundry, like sanity, is just one cycle away from unraveling. Outside, the seasons turned. Snow would drift languidly past the tall asylum windows, or the breeze of summer would chase the steam from the high eaves. But inside the laundry, the same rhythm beat on. Soapsuds, cloth, rinse, wring, fold. A strange lullaby of purpose in a place not known for clarity. And tomorrow, more laundry. Unless, of course, you found yourself reassigned to the sewing hall, where needles had an entirely different rhythm. We'll drift toward that next. But for now, let the low hiss of boiling water and the soft flapping of freshly pressed sheets hum you gently to rest. Poor Miss Lavinia Wexley simply asked for a different type of pudding at supper. That's all. And yet, into the moral therapy cell she went, for what Dr. Blanchard termed a brief period of recalibration. You see, 19th century asylums had a flair for euphemisms, especially ones that sounded like they were invented by a poetry-loving torturer. Moral therapy sounded like a pleasant dose of virtue with your chamomile tea, but actually involved things like solitary confinement and long lectures about being agreeable. While facing the wall, it wasn't uncommon for the staff to believe they were doing divine work. After all, this was the era when phrenology still held court at dinner parties, and everything, yes, everything, could apparently be explained by the size and bumps of one's forehead. If your skull bulged in the wrong place, you were either a criminal, a poet, or both. A real disaster if you were just someone prone to slightly messy hair. And so, with staff armed with optimism and some truly questionable science, treatment went far beyond pills and poultices. There was music therapy, sure, but not in the way you might hope. They'd literally bring in a fiddle player once a week to perform in the corridor. Whether or not the patients wanted to be serenaded mid-screaming fit was never really asked. Improved emotional output, the doctors would say to each other with grave satisfaction, as if chaos harmonized in the key of D minor. There was also a firm fixation on productive labor. According to the great minds of the institution, the soul could be soothed by weaving exactly 40 feet of linen or shelling peas at a rate of 1,000 per day. No one quite knew why that number was magical. It just seemed to quiet the rowdy ones by exhausting them into silence. Even those suffering from melancholia, what we'd now call depression, were gently shoved outside to haul soil or milk goats. Because if sadness persists after a week spent ankle-deep in topsoil, is it sadness or just a lack of shoveling? And then there was the talking cure, though that term may be generous. Patients would meet with attendants, not always doctors, who were meant to guide them back to reality with patient conversation. Unless, of course, the patient said something alarming, like admitting she missed her late husband too much or enjoyed painting landscapes. Then it was back to the quiet room, which famously contained neither quiet nor room. On Wednesdays, the institution held moral lectures in the assembly hall. These were long, droning affairs where patients were expected to sit bolt upright while administrators read aloud from their own essays on temperance and wholesomeness. The drapes would be drawn, the incense lit, which only made the room smell like burnt patience, and the speech would commence. One staff member once gave a 90-minute lecture on the importance of correct sock folding for spiritual development. 5 patients fell asleep and were accused of willful insolence. A 6th had to be escorted out after giggling uncontrollably at a joke the speaker hadn't intended to make. And yet, tucked among the absurdity, accidental kindness flickered in strange places. A nurse named Mabel left peppermint candies on windowsills, believing they warded off night terrors. A janitor taught one patient to read using old newspaper clippings. And someone, no one ever quite knew who, replaced a particularly harsh Bible verse with handwritten poetry inside the chapel hymnals scrawled in lilac ink. The asylum was its own world, its own logic-bound kingdom of contradictions, a place where madness was measured by your reaction to porridge, and health was awarded based on whether you could button your coat in a straight line. Yet amid its rigid rules and uncomfortable chairs, real humans lived. They wept over lost children. They smiled when dandelions peeked through the iron bars. They wished for different puddings and reimagined old memories with new endings. And as the gaslights dimmed each night inside the great echoing corridors of brick and whispers, someone always sang a lullaby, sometimes in French, sometimes in broken English, but always, always off-key, because even in a place designed to hem in the frayed edges of the mind, some melodies can't help but drift beneath shut doors. Now, as the night nurse makes her final rounds and the sound of keys echoes faintly down the tiled hallway, let us gently follow her steps toward the ward where the doctor's experiments with water treatments are about to take a curious turn. It is now 2:21 in the afternoon at the Rosewood Retreat for the nervously inclined, and Mrs. Agatha Bucklesworth is furiously knitting a scarf that's already longer than the asylum's west hallway. Not because she needs the garment, the heating system, such as it is, has decided with great formality to produce a steady stream of lukewarm ghost breath, but because she insists the repetitive motion keeps her from ascending into realms of imaginative doom, which seems perfectly valid. At this very moment, an orderly named Charles, who is mostly made of suspenders and button frustration, is attempting to navigate the delicate business of a group therapy walk. This is less therapy and more organized wandering, which in the 19th century was a very trendy form of psychiatric intervention known as moral treatment. The idea being, put troubled souls in clean clothes, let them walk through neatly trimmed gardens, and hope the lilacs talk more sense than the doctors. Moral treatment had that charmingly Victorian quality of being well-meaning, deeply flawed, and wrapped in just enough Latin to sound smarter than medieval bleeding. You see, dear listener, in this brave new era of psychiatric awakening, surrounding patients with beauty and structure was thought to harmonize the rattled mind, much like lovingly scolding a haunted violin. As the group shuffles down the gravel path, past an ornamental fountain that has not produced actual water since the Crimean War, it is carefully observed by the matron, Miss Penelope Featherthistle. Miss Featherthistle takes her duty seriously, mostly because her previous position was headmistress at St. Winifred's Academy for Unruly Girls, and she still carries the faint air of someone who might assign detentions for acts of whimsy. She watches particularly closely as Mr. Elbridge Sims, a man with at least 6 imaginary friends, all lawyers, attempts once again to petition for the right to be tried in mental court. His latest brief, written entirely on leaves and tied together with dandelion stems, makes a compelling, if botanically flimsy, argument. Despite the eccentricities of both patient and staff, the garden walk is not without success. Mrs. Bucklesworth hums cheerfully to herself as she knits and walks, her scarf now trailing like the tail of an indolent comet. Mr. Sims has stopped shouting legalese at squirrels and is merely muttering habeas corpus toward a patch of time. Even young Timothy Woodruff, who once attempted to dig an escape tunnel using only a dessert spoon, seems tranquil, if only because he's currently distracted by trying to teach a daffodil how to waltz. You must understand, and I say this with the sleepiest sort of fond sincerity, that to the asylum reformers of the time, this was considered utterly revolutionary. Gone were the dungeon-like cells and rusted manacles of the previous century. In their place came parlours, potted plants, and high ceilings meant to elevate the soul. One might be distressed, certainly, but distressed tastefully, in a room with a fern and a laminate of Lord Byron. Yet, for all the greenery and moral intention, the system still creaked and groaned under its own contradictions. Treatments were gentle in theory, but often depended on the whimsy of whichever mustachioed authority was on tea break. One sage doctor declared that fresh air cures melancholy, and promptly demanded all windows remain open, even in frost. Another promoted silence as the greatest balm for lunacy, leading to entire corridors where not a soul dared whisper, sneeze, or hum Schubert. But all revolutions begin unevenly. For every glimmer of human dignity restored, there was a chamber pot not emptied. For every patient allowed to paint tulips in oil, there were 3 seated stiffly in hydrotherapy tubs, wondering vaguely whether being soaked like a stale biscuit was truly medicinal. Still, there is something almost touching about the faith these 19th century doctors had in harmony. They believed quite earnestly that beauty and kindness could untangle a broken mind, that if patients walked past enough Greek columns, read from enough approved novels, and strictly avoided shellfish, they might yet be restored to reason. The walk ends, as it always does, beneath the weeping willow near the duck pond, where the pears fall with a sort of resigned plop, as though even the trees have learned to surrender gracefully to the passing of yet another orderly afternoon. Miss Featherthistle claps once, a sharp musical sound more command than applause, and the group begins their slow march back toward the main hall. Mr. Sims tips an imaginary hat to a particularly dignified goose. Mrs. Bucklesworth checks the tension in her scarf and pronounces it emotionally satisfactory. All in all, quite the successful outing. And as the sun begins its golden descent, casting long, dreamlike shadows across the hedgerows, something rather curious begins to stir in the eastern wing, quite unnoticed by anyone, except perhaps the doorknob, which has seen everything. Let's drift there next, ever so quietly. Somewhere between the lead-painted window frames and the suspiciously echoey hallways of the 19th century asylum, a revolution was taking place. Only you wouldn't recognize it unless you squinted very, very hard and tilted your head 17 degrees to the left. This wasn't a clamour of torches and pitchforks. No, this was quieter, more passive-aggressive, a kind of rebellion rooted in diagramming skulls, clutching electrotherapy wands, and endlessly muttering the phrase moral treatment like it belonged on a tea cosy. This, dear listener, was the golden age of treatment philosophies, a very serious business conducted by men with glorious beards and zero doubts. You see, in the early part of the century, trying to cure mental illness was roughly as scientific as diagnosing happiness by checking someone's urine color. Enlightenment thinkers, however, had a plan, or rather, a vague hope wrapped in a velvet waistcoat. Enter Sir Thomas More, not the one who lost his head arguing with Henry VIII, but metaphorically, as the ghost haunting every utopian idea. 19th century psychiatrists, called alienists, which sounds appropriately science fictional, wanted to create ideal societies inside the asylum walls, structured, clean, and reflective of middle-class sensibilities, like a Jane Austen novel stressed out by its own quiet. The idea, called moral treatment, was to gently rehabilitate patients. Not with chains, heavens no. Those were out of fashion by the mid-1800s, but with order, kindness, and a generous helping of linen uniforms. Patients were expected to follow routines, tend gardens, participate in music and sewing, and occasionally socialize under the strained watch of staff who desperately hoped nobody broke the tea set. In theory, it was progress. In practice, well, picture trying to correct depression with embroidery. Imagine calming mania with a strict walking schedule and porridge. Spoiler alert, results varied. One of the key instruments of this era was the asylum's daily timetable. Ah yes, the delicate tyranny of the asylum clock. Everything was arranged just so. Wake at 6, wash in cold water, never warm, for warm water was believed to encourage moral laxity. Pray, labor, dine, walk, reflect, sleep, repeat, forever. This obsession with structure came with the generous assumption that order would rehabilitate the disordered mind. But even Freud, while lounging on someone's sofa decades later, might raise a skeptical eyebrow at the belief that shelling peas in perfect silence for 3 hours could realign the psyche. And yet, amid the rituals and regimens, some gently glowing embers of sense could be seen. Some patients, particularly those of the middle class, did seem to improve, at least until they were sent back out into the unpredictability of the world, where the peas remained tragically unshucked and nobody praised them for sweeping the floor. There was, however, an underside to all this order. Not everyone received the moral version of treatment. For the poor, the immigrants, the less cooperative, or simply the misunderstood, it wasn't all harp music and calming bromides. The moral treatment era always had cracks where less scenic things hid. Overcrowding, undertrained staff, and that familiar institutional pastime of ignoring people's names for the simpler habit of calling them number 32. The alienists, like all people who had just discovered the ability to name things in Latin, remained convinced they were on the cusp of something miraculous. If only they could correctly categorize each disorder: melancholia from mania, hysteria from moral insanity, they might draw neat boundaries around chaos itself. Hints of modern psychiatry were beginning to flicker into being, like the first glimmers of morning light across an otherwise deeply troubling dormitory. But perhaps the strangest feature of it all, the part most unlikely of all, was that these massive institutions, with their ghostly architecture and highly questionable wallpaper borders, became sources of pride. City leaders bragged about their asylums the way modern towns brag about their local farmer's market or slightly famous donut shop. Why, yes, they'd beam. Our asylum has over 400 residents and 2 pianos. And in this desire to help and to hide, to treat and to control, to heal and impress, all at once, the 19th century asylum remained a place wrapped tightly in contradictions, a kind of velvet straitjacket, if you will. Now, as the lamps dim in our well-regulated ward, and the rain traces lazy fingers across the window panes, let us pause here beside the flickering gaslight. There's more to come, especially as electricity sneaks into the asylum halls. Along with some slightly alarming treatment devices that hum louder than a lullaby. If you were to close your eyes and imagine the smell of pine-scrubbed floors, copper basins, and just the faintest trace of carbolic acid, you might be drifting near the convalescent wing, the so-called mild side of the 19th century asylum. A peaceful-sounding place, if you happen to be a Victorian on a good day. But of course, in a building designed more for managing than healing, peaceful was more often a tightly cinched performance. This was where doctors might nod sagely, declare a patient improved, and transfer them from the more dreadful floors above. Floors with names like the violent ward or the incurable gallery, which sound less like medical categorizations and more like level names in a haunted house. In our gentle convalescent setting, the daily routine was a kind of theatrical harmony. Men and women were often separated by thick stone walls and gendered notions of propriety, ensuring that even the broken-minded should remain chaste. Women tended to hem cloth or take up embroidery, while men might rake gravel pathways into perfectly straight lines, an act that apparently had therapeutic value, provided you had a strong back and quiet thoughts. Supervision remained ever present, but subtly so. Attendants would glide past doors with something resembling polite indifference, vigilant but pretending not to be. Honestly, many of the staff were exhausted, underpaid, overworked, and occasionally afflicted with the same nervous ailments they were supposed to be curing. And let's not forget, the line between staff and patient was historically thinner than one might hope. There are, in fact, documented cases of attendants becoming patients, or vice versa, simply by someone misplacing a chart. Meals in the convalescent ward were more forgiving. There were still issues: overcooked mutton, the kind of tea that tastes like the memory of leaves. But at least you are unlikely to find insects in your porridge. Conversations were encouraged among the improving patients seated at long wooden tables, though nothing too stimulating. Medical opinion held that excitement of any kind was to be regarded with deep suspicion, including excitement over pie. And yet, even in this better-maintained wing, one could not escape the ritual of moral therapy. This was the era's well-intentioned but deeply patronizing notion that mental illness could be gently nudged out of the soul like a misfolded bedsheet, through order, serenity, and the occasional Bible verse. A philosophical spoonful of sugar drizzled over strict schedules and unbearable moralizing. A favorite pastime of physicians was prescribing moral entertainment. This might include poetry readings, musical recitals, or reenactments of grateful Bible scenes, like the ever-popular "Job remains patient despite everything." Patients would be praised for sitting still and not weeping during these presentations, a standard of health rarely applied outside institutional walls. On Sunday afternoons, the convalescent wing might be treated to a silent walk in the courtyard, like the world's slowest and most melancholic boarding school parade. Holding your shawl or hat properly, not staring into the distance too long, and speaking only when spoken to. These were the gospel virtues of the rehabilitating lunatic. But what truly defined this part of the asylum, this gentle corner of enforced tranquility, was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of expectations. The quiet murmur of unsettling calm that came from being watched, judged, smiled at, and recorded in a ledger by a man with a corset under his waistcoat and a very strong opinion about your knitting posture. The doctors meant well, or at least some of them did. Others just wanted glory, clinical breakthroughs, or to impress their colleagues with detailed case studies about hysterical seamstresses who came to appreciate poetry. In one notable instance, a doctor claimed a patient was cured after she enthusiastically complimented a fellow patient's needlework. I suppose if that counts as a sign of sanity, there's still hope for the rest of us. Nevertheless, there were those who quietly got better, or better enough to follow instructions, who learned the script, performed the lines, braided the straw, walked the prescribed paths, and sometimes, if all went well, their reward was release. Not rehabilitation, of course. That was still decades away as a meaningful concept, but reinsertion into a world that hadn't changed at all since they'd left it. Except now, they had to pretend they could handle it. Still, For those left behind in the convalescent wing, the days rolled by like a well-stitched, if uneven quilt. Routine, repetition, reclining occasionally in the allotted 10 minutes of authorized leisure. Just beyond the ward walls, however, another kind of order was stirring. One not rooted in tranquility, but in ledger books, bottom lines, and an ever-growing list of distracting behaviors that no one, apparently, had the budget to fix. Let's take a quiet breath and step into the administrative mind of the Victorian madhouse. Things are about to become meticulously inefficient. By the late afternoon, when the dusty hallways of the asylum seem to hum with the exhausted silence of 1,000 unresolved diagnoses, you might find yourself summoned, like a guest of honor at a rather uncomfortable tea party, to the moral therapy room. Ah yes, moral therapy. A noble phrase that sounded like it belonged in a Jane Austen novel, but unfortunately came wrapped in a straitjacket of benevolent condescension. Developed in the 18th century and clinging desperately to relevance in the 19th, moral therapy was based on the quaint idea that mental illness could be gently coaxed away through kindness, structure, and, most importantly, stern, silent disapproval of any unseemly conduct. The asylum staff, in their stiff-collared moral righteousness, treated patients as delicate but wayward pupils in a boarding school for the soul. They believed that if you introduced a routine, enforced cleanliness, and perhaps scowled encouragingly when someone tried to eat a candle, sanity might return on tiptoe like a bashful ballerina. In this therapy room, you'd find books with strong moral messages, mostly about the perils of temptation, pride, and whistling after dark. There were activities like sewing or copying Bible verses, both chosen not for their entertainment value, but for their presumed ability to shepherd wayward minds back to the luminous flock of Victorian decency. Heaven forbid anyone just paint something abstract or expressive, an accurate depiction of your inner chaos in watercolors. Absolutely not. Only still lifes and scripture. Now imagine sitting across a heavy wooden table from Matron Wiggins, who smells faintly of lavender and boiled cabbage. She watches you with a pitying smile while you awkwardly embroider an ambitious depiction of a tree that is definitely not an expression of your inner turmoil. Meanwhile, another patient beside you mutters about Napoleon under her breath, and yet another counts his teeth over and over. You are all treated with unwavering politeness, as if simply observing genteel behavior might rub off, like manners by osmosis. But don't laugh. The word moral wasn't some throwaway. In that era, many believed insanity was not merely a medical condition, but also a spiritual failing, a moral derailment, an affliction of the soul as much as the brain. The asylum, therefore, doubled as both a hospital and a classroom for troubled spirits, where madness was something to be chided gently but firmly out of its hiding place. The logic went something like this. If you woke at the same time every day, made your bed, didn't talk back, walked slowly around the grounds while, appreciating the statuary, declined gin, and learned to re-hem trousers with a sigh of gratitude, perhaps, just perhaps, you would be reborn, mentally speaking, quite like Lazarus, except instead of the Messiah, it was Nurse Gladwell from the West Wing, calling you back to life with instructions to sit up straight and behave like a lady. What's rather sweet, in a strange, overly prescriptive way, is that the people running these programs honestly thought they were doing the right thing. They genuinely believed that order, tranquility, and garden strolls with inspirational monologues could undo the wild winds of the mind. Maybe, they thought, if a person just behaves sanely long enough, Sanity itself would follow, like a courteous suitor arriving fashionably late. And no one quite embodied this hopeful delusion more than Dr. Lionel Fennings, a pioneer of moral therapy known for making all his patients wear tidy ascots and take turns reading uplifting tracts aloud at dinner. He once claimed that a patient suffering from melancholia had been cured entirely after learning etiquette and serving as assistant librarian for 3 months. Tragically, that same patient later ran away and joined an off-brand theatre troupe in Norfolk, but Dr. Fennings insisted the relapse had everything to do with improper seasoning in the lamb stew. Still, there's a peculiar comfort in all of this. The sheer earnest absurdity of it. The idea that the madness of the human mind could be outwitted by tidy routines and lace doilies. That beneath the chaos, somewhere within us all, was a version that could be charmed back into civility through prolonged exposure to Psalm 23. So there you sat in the moral therapy room, engaged in what passed for healing in those days, folding linen napkins and sipping tepid chamomile, while Nurse Gladwell made her rounds with a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. And outside, beyond the stone walls and carefully manicured hedges, the world continued its own strange dance of order and disorder, never quite tipping into one or the other. But bedtime draws near, and the lamps flicker with the amber hush of gaslight. Tomorrow brings fresh linens, another round of therapeutic gardening, and perhaps, if you're very lucky, permission to rearrange the shelves in the display cabinet. Sleep now, and we'll follow the corridors toward another curious experiment in healing, one that involves not lassos, but lightning. It's after midnight in our imaginary asylum, and the gaslights sputter like they too are ready to call it a night. Shadows skate across the tiled floor like clumsy phantoms rehearsing a poorly lit ballet. In the caretaker's cloister, a sort of barely furnished broom closet with delusions of grandeur. The night nurse dozes upright, her cap tilted like a listing ship. Elsewhere, not everyone enjoys such repose. Let us tiptoe gently to the hydrotherapy wing. Yes, hydrotherapy. The 19th century's attempt to baptize away your neuroses. Here, aquatics weren't just for leisure or Olympic aspirations. They were tailored for treating everything from melancholia to mild irritability. Think of it as the precursor to both the modern spa and the sad hotel bathtub cry. To the Victorians, water was positively magical. Running water, modern miracle. Stagnant water, still blessed probably. Cold water, very mentally clarifying apparently. Patients were submerged in tub baths for hours, sometimes even days. A fact both fascinating and moistly uncomfortable. Some were wrapped like soggy spring rolls in continuous baths. A therapeutic process in which a patient remained immersed in lukewarm water, draped in canvas netting, eyes gazing blankly at a mildewed ceiling, for anywhere from 6 hours to a staggering 24. Nurses would add warm water periodically, as if tending to the world's saddest kettle. If this doesn't sound appealing, don't worry. It also wasn't optional. One particularly popular installation was the shower room. Now, before you picture a nice steam or subtle rainfall setting, let's adjust our mental lens. These showers weren't designed by a Nordic minimalist with eucalyptus dreams. No, they entailed standing beneath a heavy iron spout, while cold water launched at your skull with the gentleness of a rail spike. A brisk, brain-tingling experience meant to jostle the nerves right into proper civility. There was also the wet sheet pack, a form of therapeutic burrito seldom mentioned in modern spa brochures. Picture this: you're wrapped snugly in cold, wet linens, layered like a traumatized lasagna, then tucked in with blankets for warmth and security. Depending on the diagnosis or the nurse's mood, you might remain trussed up like that for an hour or all night. It's unclear whether this was considered healing or just extremely cozy punishment. Now, to be fair, and because we like to balance our sarcasm with some sincerity, the asylum doctors weren't entirely villainous drip merchants. Many genuinely believed this waterlogged path was a merciful alternative to earlier, more medieval tendencies. Dunking the mentally ill in rivers, for instance, had largely fallen out of fashion by the mid-1800s, which is progress of sorts. Hydrotherapy was, in the minds of its practitioners, almost spiritual. Water could soothe, cleanse, and purify the tormented mind. Unfortunately, the execution often leaned more drench and guess than deeply therapeutic revelation. And yet, a gentle irony floats in with the mist. Some patients reportedly did find the long baths relaxing. Of course, this may have simply been due to the general asylum experience being so relentlessly overstimulating that prolonged submersion in tepid water felt like a blissful escape. Given the choice between communal sewing under the watchful eye of matron Beatrice or a semi-nude soak in a tiled cavern, well, draw your own bath. We mustn't forget that the very presence of hydrotherapy wings signaled a shift, however flawed, toward a more humane treatment of mentally afflicted individuals. Instead of cages and chains, hospitals began leaning into concepts like tranquility, temperature regulation, and the occasional moral lecture delivered beside a footbath. Toweling off from our damp detour, we drift down the corridor past the room, where patients practiced occupational therapy by painting gloomy watercolors and attempting macrame with suspiciously blunt needles. The air smells faintly of lavender and fish glue, the former from lavender sachets tucked in every corner, the latter from an unfortunate experiment in papier-mâché morale building. The hour grows late, and the gaslights are finally giving in, dimming, flickering, and folding into the darkness like tired stars. The water ceases its murmuring for the night. Even the old boiler breathes more softly, as if it too has grown contemplative. Tomorrow brings more methods, more intentions draped in questionable rituals. We'll walk down to the ward where laughter was both feared and encouraged, depending on the hour, depending on the doctor. But for now, lean back. Let the imagined water recede. Let imagination dry your feet with a warm towel, and we'll float gently onward, cradled by moonlight, into the next room of this quietly unsettling dream. Whispers filled the corridors of the asylum, stray thoughts bouncing off stone walls, stitched into the rustle of starch-stiff gowns and the hush-hush of slippered feet slipping past. Asylum nights were a suspension of time, where the ticking of a wall clock could sound like a cannon, and a sigh from the next cell could echo like thunder across the eardrums of insomnia. By 1870, nightfall in institutions like the Bloomingdale Asylum or the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was when things calmed, at least outwardly. The day's cruel therapies and well-meaning misunderstandings had given way to something less dramatic but equally unsettling. Silence. Not peace, mind you, just silence. Nurses, often male and built like industrial barn doors, paced the halls with lanterns, pausing at each door's peephole to peer inside like bashful reapers, checking if the crops were ready. Patients, wrapped cocoon-like in woolen blankets or straitjackets, depending on how spicy their day had been, lay on straw mattresses that made more noise than a Victorian ghost train. The mattresses, stuffed with hay and regret, offered little support, unless you consider moral support from a generation of farm animals. In this half-lit gloom, The importance of night attendants cannot be overstated. These were the unsung heroes of the asylum, underpaid, undertrained, and overwhelmingly under-caffeinated. Armed with a lamp and a loosely defined sense of duty, they patrolled hallways stretched to infinity, checking locks and counting patients like some kind of melancholic shepherd. But here's the strange part. Despite the institutional rigidity and the towering threat of electroconvulsive surprises, night at the asylum was often, weirdly, the safest time. During the day, doors were opened, therapies administered, some of them more therapy-adjacent than therapeutic, and chaos was entirely legal. But at night, doors stayed shut. The chaos fell asleep, or was heavily sedated, and something resembling stillness wrapped around the building. That stillness was occasionally interrupted by nocturnal rituals. Some patients, unable to sleep, would whisper poems into the crack of the door or scratch invisible figures into the walls. Others hummed strange, haunting little tunes that sounded like lullabies rewritten by Edgar Allan Poe's houseplant. And now and then, a sudden shout would ripple down the hall and jolt every other sleeper wide-eyed. They found the pigeons, someone might yell from a cell. And just like that, sleep was a game of chance again. Night staff, rarely trained in psychology, but often veterans of something, wars, poverty, or most likely just bad decisions, had varying responses. Some ignored the cries. Others entered rooms at odd hours, muttering calming platitudes like, "Shh, it's Tuesday," as though that were a universally comforting thought. Still others tried the more aggressive route, more restraints, more sedatives, more writing in observation logs that no one ever seemed to read. Sleep hygiene was an alien concept. Windows, if you had them, were nailed shut or barred. The air grew heavy with the breath of many, unventilated and unfiltered, and oil lamps flickered just enough to play terrible tricks with shadows. If you had nightmares, well, you were in the right place, friend. You just might get diagnosed. Still, through the unsettling quiet and faded starlight, some found brief solace in the predictability of the night clock. A certain creak from the wooden doorframe at midnight, the whoomp of the nurse's boots every hour, a fellow patient reciting their favorite verse from the Bible, or from the more chaotic pages of amateur astronomy. The night was a strange lullaby, made of sounds and silences you almost trusted. Of course, any dreamlike stability was subject to sudden disruption. Entire wards could be roused if one patient decided that this was the moment to test the tensile strength of their bedding. Or perhaps someone spotted a non-existent bird in their room and voiced an urgent need to tell the Pope. Nighttime lunacy wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. The asylum, in the late hours, became a theatre of softly simmering madness. And into this performance waltzed time, always ticking forward, hour by hour, toward the pale blue of dawn, toward a new round of therapies and cold porridge and staff meetings poorly disguised as coffee gossip. But for now, the building slept, or pretended to, and the whisper behind the walls grew quieter, like a story finishing, the last sentence of its own dream. Soon the sun would rise again, but not quite yet. There, in the flickering gaslight shadows of a crumbling Victorian hallway, we find ourselves at the end of the long, creaky corridor that was the 19th century insane asylum. Behind us lay wards, whispers, water therapies, and the occasional overly enthusiastic application of leeches. Ahead of us, only the hush of night, and perhaps, if the ether hadn't fully worn off, a glimmer of normalcy. By the close of that restless century, The grand old asylums that once held the promise of moral reform had largely collapsed into underfunded madhouses masquerading as moral science. The once pristine gardens, where patients were encouraged to stroll and find clarity among rhododendrons and regrets, had withered into weedy courtyards echoing with muttered prayers and the occasional rooster, "Don't ask." But the tides were turning, gently, like a cat knocking over a parlour lamp. Advances in medical science were trundling in, with Freud's couch not far from the horizon, and Thorazine preparing for her grand debut in a few decades. Reformers, some of whom even had degrees this time, began to question whether chaining a woman to the floor because she had a bad month was really the height of medical wisdom. Spoiler, it wasn't. Asylums began to drift toward gentler seas, helped along by changing public opinion and the occasional scandal someone managed to print without fainting. Those once unquestionable treatments, cold plunge baths, high-pressure institutional oatmeal, and questionable applications of medieval restraint devices, fell, one by one, into the dustbin history keeps behind the broom closet. The great Kirkbride plan hospitals, those monumental stone behemoths built in the hopes that architecture itself could cure despair, began to groan under their own weight. Towering wings meant to welcome light and air now echoed with overcrowding and understaffing. The buildings were beautiful in the same way castles are beautiful. Majestic, drafty, and not terribly conducive to mental well-being. By the last quarter of the 1800s, state legislatures, balancing anxiety with frugality, began to re-evaluate this whole business of housing thousands of mentally ill people indefinitely. Institutionalization had proven a bit like buying a yacht, incredibly expensive, not terribly practical, and someone always threw up. Community care was floated as a concept, softly, delicately, like trying to propose a trip to the moon using only a balloon and a prayer. And so, in this dusky twilight of the asylum age, the patients, those who had endured decades wrapped in coarse blankets of misunderstanding and moderately clean linens, found themselves at the precipice of a different kind of future. Would it be better? Not necessarily. But at least it wouldn't include surprise mustard plasters. For the doctors, some of whom had spent their entire career alternating between optimism and mild professional despair, it was a new riddle to solve. This time, without relying entirely on skull measurements. The field of psychiatry was beginning to step cautiously into the 20th century, laced boots and all, with journals promising less bleeding and more thinking. As for our dear matron, let's say she retired eventually. Perhaps she sashayed into the sunset with a copy of Dr. Rush's medical compendium under one arm and a cat named Pavlov under the other. She left behind her jangling keys, her infamous vinegar teas, and a hallway that had seen more slippered footsteps and nighttime worries than reason could count. The nighttime ward bell didn't toll quite so often in those final years. Instead, there were whispered conversations about reforms and outpatient care, novelties so strange they might have passed for fiction in 1825. But not anymore. The Grand Asylum, once the moral lighthouse of society's conscience, was beginning to blink out, room by room. And so now, the great rickety institution nods into slumber, tired from its efforts to help, to heal, and, yes, to control. Its walls, once bursting with the clamour of ideals and inexperience, are quiet now. Dust dances peacefully in slanted sunbeams. Somewhere, a door creaks. Somewhere else, a patient dreams in silence, no restraints binding her but sleep herself. And you, dear listener, weary traveller through madhouses and metacognition, You too may close your eyes now. The alarms have been turned down. The corridors are empty. There are no more cold basins or leather cuffs, only rest, long, quiet, and free. Sleep softly now, with the knowledge that history, even at its most absurd, was always just trying to understand the heart. And in that endless pursuit, perhaps there is peace.